This episode of Off the Shelf is brought to us by Busy Bee Vegan Skincare. Busy Bee is an all-natural skincare line dedicated to healthy, vegan, plant-based skincare and overall wellness. They offer a selection of handcrafted body scrubs, butters, and washes that not only make your skin glow but smell amazing. Their unique all-natural scents include gingerbread, ruby grapefruit, caramel cake, and morning latte. So why not treat your skin to something fresh and all-natural? Head on over to shopbusybeevegan.com today. And as a special bonus, Busy Bee is offering listeners of this podcast a 15% discount on your first order with the code OrdinaryPodcasts. Thanks for listening and enjoy this week's episode of Off the Shelf. Hello everyone, my name is Julia and this is Off the Shelf, the podcast where we take our books off of our shelves and into our hearts. On the agenda today is our mid-month check-in on Over the Woodward Wall by Deborah Baker. As usual, I'll take some time first to introduce the author before diving right in, highlighting a specific aspect of the book I think is worth our time to set our minds to and to think about. What's most interesting to me about this book though, just to start off, and maybe more generally about fantasy novels, is that it sometimes seems like the less you think about them, the more they make sense. Maybe that's really what a suspension of disbelief is, holding back our judgments, our assumptions, our systems of logic, and our prescriptions of the way the world works. Maybe, at least for me personally, that is what can be so challenging about reading fantasy novels or indulging in other media forms of the genre, is that they force us to think in ways that we haven't necessarily thought before. At the same time, and in much the same way, maybe also what I find so wonderful about fantasy novels is that they open our minds to the possibility of more, of how much more there already is out in our world, out of our narrow perspectives, just waiting to be discovered when we stop blinding ourselves to it. We don't always have to try to be the makers, the creators of beautiful things. There are beautiful things out there that we can enjoy and respect without feeling the need to have to control them. Deborah Baker, as I mentioned last time, is one of various pseudonyms used by Seanan McGuire, the highly acclaimed and award-winning author of numerous books, series, poems, short stories, and novellas. McGuire's debut novel was released in 2009, and since then she's led an absolutely prolific writing career, writing mostly within the urban fantasy genre and receiving a number of writing awards, though maybe her most highly regarded work is her 2016 release, Every Heart a Doorway, which received the Nebula, Hugo, Locus, and Alex awards. Over the Woodward Wall, as I mentioned last time as well, began as a concept within another of McGuire's works, titled Middle Game, the start of her Alchemical Journeys series, and developed and grew into the short and kind of kooky novel we're sharing the experience of reading together this month. McGuire, from what I've read of her, is a bit like the book itself, a bit kooky, unpredictable, the kind of person who is very difficult to pin down and define as this, that, or the other. So everything in me is very, very glad that that's not really what I'm here to do. On her personal website are multiple biographies of herself, some self-written and others written for her by friends, which come together, if a bit messily, to give us an idea, a taste of where McGuire's ideas and her worlds and her many, many stories come from. McGuire herself shares that she grew up moving around a lot in her early life, each of those locations lending pieces of themselves to the person she is today. If we thought that her writing, the stories she shares, are imaginative and wild, it's not hard to see where that all comes from the way that she describes her young life and her experiences. In her own words, she is the self-proclaimed champion, for example, of the game Who Here Was Bitten by the Strangest Thing? She's also a person, clearly, who can make a lot out of a very little, with an abundant and diverse set of interests, hobbies, and endeavors. She's one of those people, I swear, who must have more hours in the day than anyone else. Over the Woodward Wall, to me, reads much like a fairy tale, full of portals and kings and queens and talking owls and sentient trees, and transformations and transfigurations, and speaking more classically, of lessons and conduct. When we look at it in the context of its parent novel, Middle Game, that all kind of makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned before and last time, Over the Woodward Wall began its life as a book within a book, and more specifically within Middle Game, as a book written by an alchemist who wants to teach children the ways of alchemy without announcing their intentions out to the world. The origin and implications of Over the Woodward Wall within the world of Middle Game is interesting to me anyway, because if we take a closer look at classic fairy tales, we find that they too were largely written with similar intentions. Many folk and fairy tales began as cautionary tales or conduct literature, specifically directed largely at children as types of lessons on proper behavior and warnings for bad habits. By placing ordinary children, like potentially those reading the story, into extraordinary circumstances, the writers were able to emphasize the characters' good and bad, their rights and their wrongs, their rewards and their consequences. Fairy tales intentionally make these types of things black and white, because that makes it an easy, straightforward message and lesson. The children reading the stories see parts of themselves in the characters, and those parts of themselves are given very clear tags as binary opposites, either as good or as bad. Connected to those tags are the outcomes they can expect if they keep them up, reward or punishment, and ideally, through such a message, children are meant to be kept in line, or maybe, potentially, indoctrinated. They have every reason to want to be defined as what is good, no reason at all to want to be anything else, with no motivation to question what is good or what is bad. Connected to this idea of binaries, of good and bad or evil standing on two opposite poles, is a literary device, the character foil. A foil character is someone who stands in a stark contrast to another character, and the device is usually used to accentuate or emphasize the better qualities of the protagonist. Foils work in much the same way that binaries do in fiction. They make our reading easier by allowing us to categorize any particular character within one of two camps, most commonly as good or as bad. The harmful piece of this is that allowing ourselves this ease also discourages us from looking any deeper into character than the surface. In other words, we don't have to think about who a character really is, the choices they'll make, and where those choices will lead their stories, because by following the prescription of binaries, we seemingly are told everything we think we need to know about them. We look at the character's type, which camp they seem to represent or stand for, and the associations we make with that group we've decided they're a part of defines who they are. Foils and binaries can be useful writing techniques, but they can also so easily, either intentionally or unintentionally, be misused. Binaries and the damage they can do are something that we talked a lot about in my English studies, in the humanities, maybe most of all because they take away the human in a character. They allow and justify and reinforce cruelty and hatred against anything considered bad, anyone considered other, and they discourage the thought that this character, who we've already decided is bad, has any value whatsoever. The extra sour bit about that is that it can so easily be translated into real life. In Over the Woodward Wall, the main characters are foils to one another, but interestingly, McGuire resists the temptation to fall into the conventional trap of relying on binaries. This aspect of the book to me is quite important and quite powerful because this isn't a book that outright avoids cliché or predictability or convention. It actually plays a lot into other classical tropes because it's meant to emulate and imitate classic fairy tale and fantasy, where usually the line between good and evil is drawn quite starkly. McGuire's resisting that convention, even while she follows various others, is significant. One thing it does is that it accentuates what makes the characters human. It brings the characters, in spite of their entrance into a fantastical world, back down to earth, in a sense. It reminds us that the line between good and evil and good and bad isn't as clear-cut as we've sometimes been made to believe. And it reminds us that people, and life as a whole, aren't as simple as such an easy categorization. Neither Zib nor Avery, for example, is made out to be the good or the bad half of the binary at all times, in all places. Instead, there are various situations for each of the children where the person they are is exactly who they need to be to survive in that situation. And yet, still there are other instances where they would have been better off being anyone but themselves. The ups and downs each of the children go through in the up and under display the way that there's no one best way to be in all situations. Maybe most of all because good itself isn't a singular or constant thing. Instead, the book suggests that the best we can do in any and every situation thrown our way is to be adaptable and to be prepared for what we can never prepare for, change. And whether this book is written with adults in mind or kids, as a fanciful, fantastical adventure out of our present capability, or as a journey of self-discovery, or as a teachable moment, learning to cope with change is something that we truly can't avoid. So the earlier we learn it, the better. What's maybe most interesting to me about that is that it's not usually children who need to be taught to be adaptable. We hear cries every day about parents fretting over how they'll ever explain social issues and social changes to their children, but really what they're most confused about and conflicted over is how they come to accept it themselves. On the other hand, as kids move through their everyday, they meet challenges every step simply because of their inexperience with the ins and outs of life, and being surprised by change and having to adjust their behaviors is their normal. As we grow up, our experience grows with us, and certain rules and principles and the so-called normal ways things are is ingrained in us so that we slowly but surely lose practice and patience with being adaptable. We start to understand the way that things have always been done as the standard, the norm, and when things or people don't align with that norm, we think of it as annoying or inconvenient. More simply put, we think of it as something wrong working against what is right. When we're met with changes or surprises, what's often the most difficult about them is not that they're insurmountable, but just that they don't fit into those rules and expectations. We can't just follow routine or rule to overcome difference. We have to think a little bit harder about how to move forward from them and how to adjust our own behavior or solution accordingly to respect the fact that difference exists. Kids, on the other hand, might have a lot of questions about difference or change, but when it's explained to them, it usually doesn't take them that long to accept it and to adapt to it and to move on. To be honest, sometimes it's the kids who are better off explaining things to their parents. In the book, Avery and Zib have very different perspectives on change, and this is particularly clear even in the first chapter, upon the unexpected, unpredictable entrance of the wall, which suddenly blocks both of their ways to school. The first impression I got reading Avery's introduction was that he is a child who has never, or at least not for a long time, been allowed to be a child, to be curious and creative, and to indulge in wonder and naivety. He's a child with the logic, reason-based perspective of an adult, and as a result, he has nearly lost the ability for the adaptability of a childhood. Change is, as he describes it using an adult's words, an affront, an offense, merely an inconvenience, something well out of the realm of his understanding, and definitely out of his practice to adapt to. At times throughout the book, Avery's sense of logic and his dedication to rules will keep him strong in his own self-assurance, and therefore keep him safe in a lot of situations. But in the beginning, facing the wall, all it really does is delay his understanding. His stubbornness, even more than the wall itself, impedes his path of learning and of growth. The wall is a seemingly impossible thing in a possible place, in the words of the book, all because it doesn't adhere to the rules that we as adults have decided govern the world, even the universe. Impossibility in this sense is a really interesting and thought-provoking concept, I think, because we are really just tiny little ants on this planet with a short history and little knowledge outside of what is just within our line of view. Who are we to say what is impossible? Who are we to think or even assume that the rules we've made up have to be followed forever and ever, even when we're so often proven outright wrong in that assumption? There are things we do or use every day that would have been impossible 50 years ago, and that's only the things that we can control. Impossible things happen outside of our control too, and the absolute worst thing we can do for ourselves is to be stubborn and to claim their impossibility and to deny that they exist. In spite of his stubbornness and his adherence to golden rules, I really felt for Avery in a lot of this book, maybe because I related to him just a little bit. I was the kid who never wanted to step out of line, all because I'd so rarely done so, that the reputation I felt followed me and the fear of consequences was stronger than my want to do whatever I might have thought about doing. It meant that I didn't take a lot of risks or as many chances as I should have because I was so afraid of the thought that my acting out would relabel me as some troublemaking dumb kid who got herself into too much trouble. To a certain point, the safety I played in became my preference. But looking back now, I wonder how my entire life might have been different had I given into the Zib side of me a little bit more, taken more chances, and taken on more fear as an adventure to be had regardless of its eventuality, rather than a life-defining move I could never be allowed to forget. To Zib, on the other hand, change and unpredictabilities and impossibilities are an adventure. She holds no pretenses about the way the world ought to be. In spite of the fact that the appearance of the wall upsets what she's come to expect as a normal day, and she initially frets about how it puts her own immediate interest and comfort at risk at first, she embraces it quickly for the promise it brings for something new. Jumping headlong into the fantastic only encourages her excitement for it further. Any sense of order she has in looking out at the world, she constantly adapts to account for change. If we're looking at Zib as the sole main character, from the conventional use of foils in fiction, what we'd expect is that Zib would be rewarded for her curiosity, and Avery put in danger because he fails to accept his reality, even as it occurs right before him. This isn't exactly what happens, though. Zib, for the most part, fares better than Avery does in the Up and Under, but she's almost too adaptable at times, compliant and accepting to the point of danger, or maybe even sometimes stupidity. Because her hunger for adventure tells her she must, she accepts things, even seemingly impossible things, exactly as they are, and that too can be taken advantage of. What Zib comes to learn from Avery is that we all have to know our reasonable limits, the extent to which we will accept change, because at some point, when all we ever do is blindly accept the premises of unpredictability, we begin to put our own safety and our own good at risk. And that extends to the safety and good of others if they're under our protection or in our partnership. We can't prepare for everything and we can't stop change, but we can sometimes slow the rate at which that change takes over our understanding and our control. At times, reading Zib gave me this sense of longing almost, this want for someone I never was but wish I had been as a kid. I grew up reading fantasy stories, but I wonder now who I would have been if I'd been able to step into the book, or if I'd walked to school one day and found a wall in my path, blocking my way to normal. Would I have climbed the wall? And if I had, who would I have been more like, Avery or Zib? Would the separation from conventionality have been enough to suspend my own sense of right and wrong? Or would I have been more like Avery, wanting to cling to those rules for as long as possible? I think the contrast we see between Avery and Zib as two poles, two sides of the same coin, is a really important one because we see the good and bad of both sides. Their portrayal resists the idea that for one to be good, the other has to be bad, or one to be right, the other has to be wrong. It shows us that we can be more than one thing, and sometimes even that we have to be more than one thing, because we can't afford to stay in one place as the world picks up its pace around us. We have to adapt to the world's dynamics and its changes, because if we don't, we end up being worse off than left behind. By staying in place, we end up overwhelmed and overtaken by the roar of everything else. It's also a mistake to think that we might someday have everything figured out, because despite what we like to believe, we aren't really the peak of intelligence and existence. We aren't actually the top of the food chain, evolution's end. What we can be, though, is aware of our abilities, our place, and our power to direct our lives and our choices and to control the way that we adapt to and respond to change. In our lives, we come to experience and circumstance that sometimes brings out the best and the worst in us. But what the book suggests is important to remember is that those moments don't necessarily have to define us or the rest of our lives. We can make bad decisions or mistakes without being damned absolutely. Good and bad are a lot more complex than maybe even we wish them to be. And the harder we try to make them simple, the more difficult it actually gets to draw the line between them and develop a realistic sense of right and wrong. This story, for both Avery and Zib, is one of growing up. And for each of them, what that means is something specifically different in some ways, but similar too in where it all leads them, to balance. Overall, balance is what McGuire values over conventional binary too. Instead of preferencing one side over the other, she shows the way that neither one nor the other is perfect or imperfect, wholly good or bad. She does this by portraying Zib and Avery as children who get into trouble and make mistakes no matter what they do. They are two people, two children who look at each other and have hardly begun to see past their differences before realizing how greatly they actually rely on one another for balance within themselves. She writes them as dynamic and discerning and problem-solving, and it's so refreshing and beautiful that throughout they feel as real as they do. It's especially refreshing to me because they're children, and children aren't usually written about in this way. These two kids are anything but dumb and naive and in need of guidance. They have it. They know what's what. Probably better than their parents ever would. Before I get into too many specifics, though, I think I'd better cut myself off. I hope that Over the Woodward Wall is something that sneaks into your heart the way that it's crept into mine. I also hope that you've enjoyed this always messy mid-month check-in, and I hope that you'll join me again soon here on Off the Shelf, the book podcast where we take our books off of our shelves and into our hearts. Until next time, take good care and happy reading. The Off the Shelf podcast is a proud member of the Ordinary Podcasting Network. To learn more about this podcast or the network, please visit ordinarypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe or leave us a comment. Thank you so much, and take care.